On the morning of October 1st, 331 BC, a young Macedonian king stood at the edge of a perfectly leveled plain in Mesopotamia, staring at an army nearly 3 times the size of his own. The Persian Empire, the largest, wealthiest, most powerful force the world had ever known, had assembled everything it possessed for this single moment. War elephants from India towered above the battlefield like moving fortresses, their tusks gleaming in the early sunlight. 200 scythe chariots, with blades extending from their wheels like mechanical demons, waited to tear through flesh and bone. Over 100,000 Persian warriors stretched across the horizon, their armor glinting like a sea of bronze and gold, while Alexander commanded fewer than 50,000 men. This was the Battle of Gaugamela, and it would determine the fate of civilization itself. The stakes could not have been higher. If Alexander lost this battle, his invasion would collapse, his army would be annihilated thousands of miles from home, and the Persian Empire would continue its dominance over the known world for generations to come. But if somehow, impossibly, he could defeat King Darius III and his massive host, the greatest empire in human history would fall, and a new age would dawn. Everything Alexander had fought for over the past 3 years, every victory at Granicus and Issus, every mile marched through hostile territory, would be rendered meaningless if he failed here. The world cared because this battle represented far more than territorial conquest. The Persian Achaemenid Empire had ruled from India to Egypt, from the Black Sea to the Arabian Desert, for over 2 centuries. Its wealth was legendary, its armies considered invincible by sheer numbers alone. Against this colossus stood Alexander, a 25-year-old king who had inherited his father's army and his father's dream of Greek liberation from Persian influence. But Alexander wanted more than liberation. He wanted the entire empire. His ambition was so audacious it bordered on madness. No Greek force had ever conquered Persia. Most thought it impossible. The Battle of Gaugamela would prove them either brilliantly right or catastrophically wrong. At the center of this clash stood 2 men whose destinies had become inexorably intertwined. Alexander III of Macedon, called the Great even in his own lifetime, and Darius III Gaugamela, the last king of the Achaemenid dynasty. Alexander was young, bold, trained since childhood in warfare and philosophy by Aristotle himself. He had already proven his tactical genius at Granicus and Issus, but those had been preliminary engagements. Darius, by contrast, was older, wealthier, commanding resources beyond imagination. He had fled from Alexander at Issus, and the shame of that retreat burned within him. Now, on ground of his own choosing, with an army assembled from every corner of his vast empire, Darius was determined to crush the Macedonian upstart once and for all. But Darius didn't know that Alexander had spent months analyzing his every move, understanding his psychology, preparing tactics so innovative they would be studied by military commanders for thousands of years. The Persian king believed numbers would decide this battle. He was about to discover that genius, discipline, and calculated audacity could overcome even the most overwhelming odds. What do you think? Could brilliant tactics really defeat an army 3 times larger, or was Alexander's victory at Gaugamela the result of something more, divine favor, luck, or perhaps fatal mistakes by his opponent? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. The plains near the village of Gaugamela, in what is now northern Iraq, seemed designed by the gods themselves for a massive pitched battle. Flat, expansive, and stretching endlessly toward the horizon, this battlefield offered no natural defenses, no terrain advantages, just open ground where armies could deploy in their full glory and clash without obstruction. Ancient accounts describe it as desolate plains, made uninhabitable by a lack of water, a harsh landscape where the earth itself seemed hostile to life. Yet for Darius III, this barren expanse was perfect. The Persian king had specifically chosen this location and had spent weeks preparing it for battle. His engineers had leveled sections of the plain even further, removing rocks, filling ditches, smoothing every bump that might impede his cavalry and his most terrifying weapons, the scythed chariots. These wheeled terrors, with razor-sharp blades protruding from their axles, needed perfectly flat ground to build speed and momentum before crashing into enemy formations, turning soldiers into ribbons of flesh. Darius understood that on this prepared battlefield, his numerical superiority would be maximized. His cavalry could sweep around Alexander's flanks, encircle the smaller Macedonian force, and methodically destroy them. But why was Gaugamela itself so strategically critical? The battle's location placed it at the crossroads of empire. To the south lay Babylon, the ancient jewel of Mesopotamia, repository of wealth and administrative power. Beyond Babylon stretched the heartland of Persia itself, Susa, Persepolis, Ecbatana, the great capitals where Persian kings had ruled for generations. If Alexander could break through at Gaugamela, nothing would stand between him and these treasures. The path to total conquest would open before him like an unlocked door. Conversely, if Darius could destroy Alexander here, the Macedonian threat would end permanently. The young king would become just another failed conqueror, his body left to rot in the Mesopotamian sand. The odds Alexander faced would have caused any rational commander to retreat. Ancient sources disagree on exact numbers, but the consensus suggests Darius commanded somewhere between 100,000 to 250,000 troops, though the more reliable estimates place it around 100,000 to 120,000. Alexander's force numbered approximately 40,000 infantry and 7,000 cavalry, roughly 47,000 men total. The Macedonians were outnumbered more than 2 to 1, possibly 3 to 1. But numbers only told part of the story. The composition of forces revealed even starker disparities. Darius's army represented the full diversity and power of the Persian Empire. On his left flank stood the cavalry from Bactria, Scythia, and Arachosia, horsemen from the steppes who had grown up in the saddle, considered among the finest mounted warriors in the world. His center contained the elite units, the 10,000 immortals, the personal bodyguard of the Persian kings, whose ranks were perpetually maintained at exactly 10,000 through immediate replacement of casualties, Greek mercenary hoplites, experienced professionals who fought in the traditional phalanx formation with long spears and heavy shields, and the king's own guard, positioned directly around Darius himself. On the right flank, more cavalry units from across the empire, Armenians, Cappadocians, Syrians, created a wall of horsemen that extended far beyond where Alexander's smaller force could reach. Then there were the special weapons. 15 war elephants from India, creatures the Macedonians had never encountered in significant numbers, massive beasts that could trample infantry and terrify horses. Though ultimately they would have minimal impact on the battle's outcome, their psychological effect was considerable. Imagine Greek soldiers who had never seen an elephant suddenly facing these towering animals equipped with armored mahouts and missile-throwing platforms. More dangerous were the 200 scythed chariots positioned in front of the Persian lines, ready to charge forward and carve lanes of death through the Macedonian phalanx. Alexander's army, by contrast, was smaller but refined to a deadly edge. His core strength lay in 2 revolutionary military innovations perfected by his father, Philip II, and raised to genius by Alexander himself: the Macedonian phalanx and the companion cavalry. The phalanx consisted of infantry armed with the sarissa, an 18-foot pike that created an impenetrable hedge of spear points when soldiers fought in tight formation. These men had trained together for years, developing a cohesion and discipline that allowed them to maneuver as a single organism. But the phalanx was defensive, designed to pin enemy forces in place. The offensive power came from the companion cavalry, elite horsemen organized into 8 squadrons of 200 to 300 men each, led by aristocratic officers who had trained since childhood in mounted warfare. At the center of these squadrons rode the Agema, the royal squadron, commanded by Alexander himself. These weren't just cavalry, they were shock troops, trained to charge in the revolutionary wedge formation, a triangle with the commander at the tip, designed to concentrate maximum force at a single point and punch through enemy lines. Philip II had adopted this formation from the Scythians and Thracians, and Alexander had perfected it. The wedge formation was both elegant and brutal in its design. Picture a triangle of horsemen, the commander visible at the front, each subsequent row expanding behind him, 20 men deep and 20 men wide at the base in a standard 200-man squadron. The formation could be solid, every position filled, or hollow, creating greater size and flexibility. The commander led from the most dangerous position, inspiring his men while maintaining maximum visibility and control. When the wedge struck an enemy line, it concentrated the kinetic energy of hundreds of horses and riders into the smallest possible space, creating enormous penetrating power. But the wedge had a critical limitation. It only worked if there was a gap to exploit. A solid, unbroken enemy line would absorb the charge and swallow the cavalry. This meant the phalanx had to create the conditions for the cavalry's success by pinning enemy forces, creating pressure, forcing them to commit reserves, and opening those precious gaps. The entire Macedonian tactical system depended on perfect coordination between infantry holding the center and cavalry striking at the critical moment. Alexander understood something Darius did not. Warfare wasn't just about numbers. It was about timing, coordination, and psychological leverage. He had studied the Persian defeat at Marathon over a century earlier, where Athenian Greeks had used innovative tactics to overcome Persian numerical superiority. He had learned from his father's victories, from every engagement he had personally commanded. Now, facing the largest army he had ever encountered, Alexander planned to employ a tactical approach so sophisticated that military historians would debate its nuances for millennia. The key figures in this drama each carried their own burdens and brilliance. Alexander, at 25 years old, was already a legend, but he knew one mistake here would end everything. His right-hand man, Parmenion, was a veteran general who had served Alexander's father and brought decades of experience to the battlefield. Parmenion would command the left flank, the most vulnerable position in Alexander's formation, where he would face the overwhelming Persian cavalry assault designed to envelop and destroy. The relationship between Alexander and Parmenion embodied a tension between youthful audacity and cautious wisdom, a tension that would define the battle itself. Darius III, meanwhile, carried the weight of empire and the shame of previous defeat. Ancient sources describe him as a man of physical courage. He had gained his throne partly through reputation as a warrior, but lacking the strategic vision to counter an opponent like Alexander. After fleeing from Issus, Darius had spent 2 years rebuilding, assembling this massive army, preparing this perfect battlefield. He was determined to stand and fight this time, to prove himself worthy of his ancestors who had ruled the known world. Yet his strategy remained fundamentally simple: use overwhelming numbers to envelop and destroy. He had learned little from his previous defeat, and that failure of imagination would prove fatal. The psychological dimensions of the coming battle were as important as the physical. When Alexander's scouts reported the size of the Persian army, many Macedonian soldiers must have felt their confidence waver. The night before the battle, Parmenion allegedly suggested a night attack to catch the Persians off guard, to negate their numerical advantage in the darkness. Alexander refused, declaring, "I will not steal a victory." Whether this actually happened or was propaganda crafted later, the story reveals Alexander's understanding that battles were won in the mind before they were won on the field. He needed his men to believe they could win a fair fight against impossible odds. The ancient sources tell another revealing anecdote about that night. After inspecting the Persian positions and making his final dispositions, Alexander allegedly went to his tent and slept so soundly that Parmenion had to wake him the next morning. His generals found him still sleeping while the army prepared for battle. Whether true or invented, this story served a purpose. It demonstrated supreme confidence to soldiers who desperately needed to believe their king knew something they did not. While Darius kept his troops on alert all night, fearing a Macedonian surprise attack, Alexander rested. This contrast alone revealed much about the psychological state of both commanders. As dawn broke on October 1st, 331 BC, both armies deployed for battle. The Macedonians arranged themselves in their characteristic formation, the phalanx in the center, cavalry on both flanks, with the elite companions under Alexander himself on the right. But Alexander had made crucial modifications for this engagement. Understanding he would be outnumbered and likely encircled, he arranged his forces in what historians call a hollow square or echelon formation, the flanks angled back slightly, with strong reserves positioned behind and to the sides of the main line. This meant that even if the Persians swept around his flanks, they would encounter fresh troops rather than an exposed rear. It was a defensive innovation within an offensive battle plan, a safety net beneath a high-wire act. The Persian deployment was magnificent and terrifying. Their lines stretched far beyond the Macedonian flanks on both sides, creating the visual impression of inevitable encirclement. In front, the scythed chariots waited, their blades catching the morning light. Behind them, the cavalry wings prepared to sweep forward. At the center, around Darius himself in his royal chariot, stood the elite infantry, immortals and Greek mercenaries who would hold the line while the cavalry performed its enveloping maneuver. It was textbook Persian strategy: fix the enemy center, overwhelm the flanks, encircle and destroy. But Alexander had no intention of fighting a textbook battle. Can genius and discipline overcome raw numerical superiority? Or does the larger army always win in the end? Keep watching to discover the shocking tactical innovations that would change ancient warfare forever. The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the leveled plain as both armies completed their deployments. The air itself seemed to hold its breath, that strange suspended moment before violence erupts when thousands of men stand ready to kill or die. Alexander rode along his lines on Bucephalus, his legendary black stallion, visible to every soldier in his distinctive armor and plumed helmet. He was ensuring his men could see him, knowing that in the chaos to come, his visibility would be their anchor. Then he gave the order to advance. But the Macedonians didn't march straight forward toward the Persian center as Darius expected. Instead, Alexander angled his entire army obliquely to the right, moving diagonally across the battlefield. This maneuver immediately disrupted Darius's carefully prepared battle plan. The perfectly leveled ground where the scythed chariots were supposed to charge lay in the center, but Alexander was moving his forces toward rougher terrain on the edge of the prepared area. If he could draw the battle onto ground that hadn't been leveled, the chariots would lose much of their effectiveness. Darius recognized the danger immediately. If Alexander moved too far right, he would occupy terrain that nullified Persian advantages. The Persian king ordered his left-wing cavalry, the Bactrians, Scythians, and other steppe horsemen, to attack Alexander's far-right flank and force the Macedonians back toward the center. These were elite mounted warriors, and they surged forward in a mass of horses, dust, and weaponry. The first blood of Gaugamela was drawn on the extreme right of Alexander's formation. The Macedonian light cavalry and advance units crashed into the Persian horsemen in a swirling melee. Steel rang against steel, horses screamed, men fell and were trampled. The fighting was fierce and chaotic, with neither side gaining a clear advantage initially. But Alexander had planned for this. His light cavalry wasn't meant to defeat the Persian flank, they were meant to absorb it, to tie down thousands of Persian horsemen in a grinding engagement that would prevent them from affecting the main battle. As the cavalry battle raged on the far right, Darius unleashed his terrifying secret weapon, the scythed chariots. 200 of these mechanical death machines rolled forward, their drivers whipping the horses into a gallop, blades spinning as they built speed. The Macedonian phalanx stood directly in their path, a wall of shields and bristling sarissa pikes. To the Persian soldiers watching, it must have seemed inevitable. Those chariots would tear through the Macedonian infantry like scythes through wheat, opening massive gaps that cavalry could exploit. But Alexander had prepared for this too. As the chariots thundered closer, Macedonian light infantry, javelin throwers and archers who had been positioned in front of the phalanx, moved forward and began targeting the chariot drivers and horses. These missiles, thrown by men trained specifically for this moment, struck the exposed charioteers and the unarmored horses. Drivers fell from their seats. Horses stumbled and veered off course. The orderly charge began to fragment into individual chariots careening across the battlefield. When the remaining chariots reached the Macedonian phalanx, something extraordinary happened. The formation opened. Companies of pikemen stepped aside with practiced precision, creating lanes through which the chariots could pass harmlessly. It was a maneuver that required perfect discipline and timing. One moment too early and the chariots would adjust their course. One moment too late and soldiers would be cut down. But the Macedonian infantry had trained for years together, and they executed the movement flawlessly. The chariots rolled through the gaps and continued into the rear, where reserves were waiting to finish them off. The feared scythed chariots, Darius's supposed battle winner, had been neutralized almost completely. This tactical innovation, using light troops to disrupt the charge, then opening lanes in the phalanx, was something Persian commanders had never encountered. It demonstrated the sophistication of Macedonian training and Alexander's ability to prepare specific countermeasures for known threats. But the chariot attack had served one purpose for Darius. It had masked the movement of his cavalry wings. While the Macedonians dealt with the chariots, massive numbers of Persian horsemen were sweeping around both flanks, attempting to envelop Alexander's army. On the Macedonian left, Parmenion faced the full weight of the Persian right wing, thousands of cavalry crashing into his position. The veteran general fought desperately to hold his ground, but the pressure was enormous. Persian horsemen were threatening to break through, to reach the Macedonian rear and cause a catastrophic collapse. On Alexander's right, the situation was equally desperate. Despite his light cavalry's efforts, Persian horsemen were pushing past the Macedonian flank. Some Persian units actually managed to reach the Macedonian baggage train in the rear, creating chaos among the camp followers and supply wagons. For a moment, it seemed Darius's strategy of envelopment was working. But this was exactly what Alexander had been waiting for. By angling his advance to the right and provoking Persian cavalry attacks on both flanks, Alexander had forced Darius to commit his mobile reserves. The Persian line, initially so impressively vast, was now stretched thin. More critically, as Persian cavalry units flowed outward to engage the Macedonian flanks, gaps began opening in the Persian center. The perfect, unbroken line that had stretched across the plain was developing weak points. Alexander saw it. From his position at the head of the companion cavalry, the young king had been watching the battle develop, waiting for this exact moment. The Persian center, which had seemed so solid, now showed cracks. Units had shifted to support the flanks. The density of troops directly in front of Darius had thinned. And most importantly, a gap had opened between the Persian left-center cavalry and the elite infantry protecting the king. It was time. Alexander raised his arm, and the companion cavalry formed their wedge. 800 of the finest horsemen in the ancient world arranged themselves in a triangle, with Alexander himself at the point. Behind them, supporting infantry units prepared to follow the cavalry breakthrough. This was the moment Alexander had trained for his entire life. The decisive charge that would either win an empire or end in his death. He kicked Bucephalus forward, and the wedge began to move. At first it was a trot, the formation maintaining perfect cohesion as it angled toward the gap in the Persian line. Then a canter, horses breathing hard, the thunder of hooves building like an approaching storm. Then a full gallop, the entire wedge of companion cavalry transformed into a single weapon. A spear point of horseflesh and bronze aimed at the heart of the Persian army. The impact when they struck was catastrophic. The wedge formation concentrated hundreds of horses and riders into the smallest possible space, creating penetrating power that no ancient infantry could withstand. Alexander and his companions smashed through the weakened Persian line like a hammer through pottery. Persian soldiers tried to close ranks, but the momentum was unstoppable. The Macedonian sarissas, longer than Persian spears, gave the companions reach advantage. The horses, trained for battle, trampled any who stood in their way. And then Alexander was through, inside the Persian formation, wheeling his cavalry toward the greatest prize on the battlefield, King Darius III himself. The Persian king's position was suddenly exposed. His royal guard, the elite immortals and Greek mercenaries who were supposed to protect him, were being engaged by the Macedonian phalanx advancing in the companions' wake. The gap Alexander had exploited now became a breach, and more Macedonian units were pouring through. Darius, from his royal chariot, could see Alexander cutting his way forward, clearly visible in his distinctive armor, personally killing Persian guardsmen with his cavalry lance. It was Issus all over again. What happened next would determine not just this battle, but the fate of an empire that had stood for 2 centuries. Could Alexander reach Darius before Persian reserves could seal the breach? The answer would shock the ancient world. Darius watched Alexander's companions carve through his royal guard like a knife through silk, and something inside the Persian king broke. Ancient sources describe him as physically brave. He had won his throne partly through personal valor in combat. But standing in his chariot, surrounded by dying bodyguards as a wedge of Macedonian cavalry bore down on his position with terrifying speed, Darius made the decision that would end his empire. He fled. Not a tactical retreat, not a strategic withdrawal, but a panic-driven flight from the battlefield. The Persian king turned his royal chariot and whipped his horses into a run, abandoning his army while the battle still raged. This single act of cowardice, or perhaps pragmatic self-preservation, transformed what might have been a hard-fought Persian victory into a catastrophic rout. When soldiers throughout the Persian center saw their king fleeing, their morale collapsed. If Darius himself had no faith in victory, why should they die her? The Persian center began to disintegrate. Units that had been fighting in good order suddenly broke and ran. The Greek mercenaries, professionals to the end, tried to maintain formation, but they were being overwhelmed by the advancing Macedonian phalanx and were increasingly isolated as Persian troops fled around them. The elite immortals, whose formation had never broken in centuries of warfare, found themselves abandoned by their king and fighting for their lives rather than for empire. Within minutes, the entire Persian center dissolved into a mass of fleeing soldiers, each man desperate to escape the Macedonian killing machine. Alexander wanted to pursue Darius personally, to capture or kill the Persian king and end this war in a single stroke. But at that critical moment, a messenger reached him from the left flank. Parmenion was in desperate trouble and needed immediate assistance. While Alexander had been breaking through the Persian center, the situation on the Macedonian left had deteriorated severely. Parmenion's forces were being overwhelmed by wave after wave of Persian cavalry attacks. The Persian right wing, composed of some of the finest horsemen in the empire, had pressed the Macedonian left so hard that parts of the formation were collapsing. Some Persian cavalry units had actually broken through entirely and were attacking the Macedonian rear areas. If Parmenion's flank collapsed completely, the Persians could roll up the entire Macedonian army from the side, turning Alexander's brilliant breakthrough into a trap that would destroy his entire force. Alexander faced an impossible choice: chase Darius and potentially end the war immediately, or turn back to rescue Parmenion and risk letting the Persian king escape. For a man of Alexander's ambition and aggression, the decision must have been agonizing. But he was not just a warrior, he was a commander responsible for his entire army. He turned back. Leading his companion cavalry, Alexander executed a difficult maneuver in the midst of battle, wheeling his forces around and charging toward the Persian cavalry that was threatening Parmenion's position. This required crossing part of the battlefield already choked with fleeing Persians and advancing Macedonians, maintaining formation in chaos, and then striking the Persian right wing from an unexpected angle. The discipline and training of the companion cavalry showed again as they maintained cohesion despite the confusion. When Alexander's cavalry struck the Persian forces attacking Parmenion, the impact was decisive. The Persian horsemen, who had been focused on breaking through the Macedonian left, suddenly found themselves attacked from behind and the side by the most elite cavalry unit in Alexander's army. This multi-directional pressure, Parmenion holding firm in front, Alexander attacking from the flank, was more than the Persian cavalry could withstand. Their formation broke, and the Persian right wing joined the general rout that had already consumed the center. The battlefield that had been a carefully orchestrated clash of massive armies dissolved into chaos. Over 100,000 Persian soldiers were fleeing in all directions, pursued by Macedonian cavalry who cut them down mercilessly. The sandy plain kicked up enormous clouds of dust that made visibility nearly impossible. Ancient sources describe it as a dust storm that enveloped the entire area, turning the late afternoon into near darkness. In this choking, blinding haze, men ran for their lives, often unable to see more than a few feet in front of them. Darius didn't stop running until he had put the Tigris River between himself and Alexander's army. He gathered what remnants he could find. A few units of the Bactrian cavalry, some of the immortals, perhaps 2,000 Greek mercenaries who had maintained discipline even in defeat. The Persian king gave a speech to these survivors, promising to raise another army to continue the fight from the eastern provinces of his empire. But everyone listening must have known the truth. The Achaemenid Empire had just died on the plains of Gaugamela. As night fell, the Macedonians controlled the battlefield. They had won a victory so complete, so total, that it defied belief. Against an army more than twice their size, in a battle where they had been nearly enveloped and destroyed, Alexander's tactics and his soldiers' discipline had achieved the impossible. The immediate aftermath was grim. The field was littered with Persian dead, estimates ranging into tens of thousands. Macedonian casualties were surprisingly light, perhaps a few thousand killed and wounded, though exact numbers from ancient sources are unreliable. Alexander didn't rest. He immediately ordered a pursuit of Darius, but the Persian king had too much of a head start. The Macedonian cavalry rode through the night trying to catch him, but Darius remained always just beyond reach, fleeing eastward toward Ecbatana and the distant provinces of his crumbling empire. Alexander realized that capturing the Persian king would have to wait. There was a greater prize within immediate reach: Babylon. The ancient city, jewel of Mesopotamia, lay open to Alexander now. With the Persian army destroyed and Darius fleeing eastward, nothing stood between the Macedonian king and the richest cities in the known world. Within days, Alexander marched south and the gates of Babylon opened to him without resistance. The city's population, calculating that opposition was futile and submission might bring mercy, welcomed the conqueror with flowers and ceremony. From Babylon, the road to Susa and Persepolis, the very capitals of Persian power, lay undefended. In those hectic days after Gaugamela, the reality of what had happened began to sink in for both victors and vanquished. Alexander had not just won a battle, he had broken the military power of the Persian Empire in a single afternoon. The empire that had dominated the known world for over 2 centuries, that had burned Athens and humbled Greece, that had seemed eternal and invincible, had collapsed because one young king understood that warfare was not about size but about timing, coordination, and exploiting psychological weaknesses. The tactics Alexander employed at Gaugamela would be studied by military commanders for thousands of years. The oblique advance, drawing enemy forces out of position. The echelon formation with refused flanks and strong reserves, turning his army into a mobile fortress that could not be easily enveloped. The use of light troops to neutralize the scythed chariots. The phalanx opening lanes for chariots to pass through harmlessly. The cavalry wedge exploiting gaps created by enemy movements. The perfectly timed decisive charge at the exact moment when the enemy line was weakest. The multi-directional attack that rescued his left flank. Each of these elements demonstrated innovation and mastery. But perhaps the most brilliant aspect was psychological. Alexander understood Darius better than Darius understood himself. He knew from Issus that the Persian king would flee if personally threatened. So Alexander designed his entire battle plan around creating that personal threat, breaking through to Darius's position and forcing him to choose between standing his ground or running. When Darius ran, as Alexander had calculated he would, the Persian army's command structure collapsed and defeat became rout. The victory was so complete that ancient sources struggled to explain it. Some attributed it to divine favor. Surely the gods themselves fought for Alexander. Others emphasized Persian mistakes and Persian cowardice, particularly Darius's flight from the battlefield. But the truth was simpler and more profound. Alexander had revolutionized ancient warfare through innovation, training, and tactical genius. He had proven that a smaller, better trained, more intelligently commanded force could defeat numerical superiority through superior tactics and leadership. As Alexander accepted the surrender of Babylon and prepared to march on Persepolis, he knew that Gaugamela had transformed him from a regional conqueror into a world historical figure. He was no longer just the king of Macedon. He was the de facto ruler of the largest empire the world had ever seen. Everything he had dreamed, everything his father had planned, had come to fruition in a single day of brilliant tactics and calculated audacity. The consequences of Gaugamela rippled outward from that dusty Mesopotamian plain like shockwaves, reshaping the ancient world in ways that echo even today. Within months of the battle, Alexander controlled Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis, the three greatest cities of the Persian Empire. He ceremonially burned the palace at Persepolis, symbolically ending Achaemenid rule after 220 years of continuous power. The Persian Empire, which had seemed eternal, had been destroyed by a 25-year-old Macedonian king in less than 4 years of campaigning. Darius III never recovered from his flight at Gaugamela. He fled eastward, trying desperately to raise new armies from the distant provinces, but his authority had evaporated with his courage on the battlefield. Satraps who might once have obeyed him now calculated their own survival. In 330 BC, less than a year after Gaugamela, Darius was betrayed and murdered by his own subordinate, Bessus the satrap of Bactria, who hoped to buy favor with Alexander by eliminating the old king. Alexander allegedly wept when he found Darius's body, whether from genuine emotion or political theater, and gave his fallen enemy a royal Persian funeral. With Darius dead, Alexander declared himself the legitimate successor to the Achaemenid throne, positioning his conquest not as foreign invasion but as dynastic transition. The cultural impact of Gaugamela extended far beyond immediate political changes. Alexander's victory opened the East to Greek culture in a phenomenon historians call Hellenization, the spread of Greek language, art, philosophy, and customs across the former Persian territories. Cities founded by Alexander or his successors, like Alexandria in Egypt, became centers of learning and cultural fusion where Greek and Eastern traditions merged. The Library of Alexandria, the Lighthouse, the scientific advances of the Hellenistic period, all emerged from this cultural mixing made possible by Alexander's conquests. But the legacy was not uniformly positive. The Persian Empire, for all its autocracy, had allowed considerable local autonomy and cultural diversity. Greek conquest brought Greek cultural imperialism, an insistence that Greek ways were superior and should be adopted by conquered peoples. This created resentment that would simmer for generations, eventually contributing to the fragmentation of Alexander's empire after his death. The cultural wounds opened by forced Hellenization took centuries to heal. Militarily, Gaugamela established principles of warfare that influenced tactical thinking for over 2,000 years. Alexander's use of combined arms, infantry and cavalry working in precise coordination, became the model for effective military organization. His emphasis on mobility, flexibility, and exploiting enemy weaknesses rather than simply matching force with force revolutionized how generals thought about battle. The concept of the decisive battle, where one engagement could determine the fate of empires, this was proven at Gaugamela and shaped military strategy through Napoleon's campaigns and beyond. The battle also demonstrated the critical importance of leadership in warfare. Alexander's personal bravery, leading from the front, visible to his men, sharing their dangers, inspired loyalty and extraordinary effort from soldiers who knew their king would never ask them to go where he wouldn't go himself. This model of charismatic leadership influenced military commanders through Alexander's imitators like Julius Caesar and later conquerors who saw themselves as heirs to Alexander's legacy. Yet Gaugamela had its bitter dimensions, costs that complicate any simple celebration of Alexander's genius. Tens of thousands of Persian soldiers died on that battlefield or in the chaotic pursuit afterward. They were not just casualties of Alexander's ambition, they were men with families, communities that mourned their loss, children who grew up without fathers. The wealth Alexander seized from Persian treasuries funded his continued campaigns but represented generations of taxation extracted from ordinary people. His conquest brought war to regions that had known peace under Persian administration. Alexander himself never returned home to Macedon. The victory at Gaugamela, rather than satisfying his ambition, seemed to inflame it. He pushed eastward into India, fighting battles and founding cities, until his exhausted army finally refused to go farther. He died in Babylon in 323 BC, at age 32, possibly from disease, possibly from poisoning. The historical record remains unclear. His empire immediately fragmented as his generals fought over the pieces, creating the Hellenistic kingdoms that would dominate the eastern Mediterranean for 3 centuries but never achieving the unity Alexander had imposed. The Persian Empire's destruction created a power vacuum that would eventually be filled by Rome in the west and Parthian dynasties in the east, but the cultural and political landscape of the ancient world had been permanently altered. Persia itself would not regain full independence until the Sasanian dynasty arose in the 3rd century AD, over 500 years after Gaugamela. The memory of lost empire would haunt Persian cultural identity for centuries. From our perspective, over 2,300 years later, Gaugamela represents something both magnificent and troubling: the power of human genius and the cost of human ambition. Alexander's tactical brilliance was genuine. Military historians agree that his performance at Gaugamela represents one of the finest examples of battlefield command in recorded history. His ability to see patterns in chaos, to coordinate multiple moving parts, to time his decisive strike perfectly, reflected cognitive abilities and military instinct that border on inexplicable. In that narrow sense, Gaugamela was a masterpiece. But it was a masterpiece written in blood, purchased with the destruction of an ancient empire and the subjugation of millions. The Greek historian Plutarch, writing centuries later, captured this ambivalence when he asked whether Alexander's conquests elevated or degraded humanity, whether spreading Greek culture justified the violence required to spread it. These questions have no simple answers, which is precisely why Gaugamela remains relevant today. The universal meaning we can extract from Gaugamela transcends its specific historical context. The battle demonstrates that intelligence, preparation, and innovative thinking can overcome apparently overwhelming obstacles, a lesson applicable far beyond military contexts. It shows that leadership matters, that individuals can shape history through force of will and clarity of vision. It proves that established powers, no matter how dominant they seem, can fall to challengers who understand them better than they understand themselves. But Gaugamela also warns us about the costs of ambition unchecked by wisdom. Alexander won the world but died young, never seeing his homeland again, his empire fragmenting the moment he could no longer hold it together by personal charisma. Darius lost his empire because he never adapted, never learned from defeats, never developed the imaginative flexibility to counter an opponent who thought differently than any enemy Persia had faced before. Both men were, in different ways, prisoners of their own psychology, Alexander unable to stop conquering, Darius unable to stop fleeing. The Battle of Gaugamela stands as one of those rare moments when the arc of history bends visibly, when we can point to a specific day and say, here, the world changed. October 1st, 331 BC marked the end of the Persian Empire and the beginning of the Hellenistic Age, the moment when East and West collided and merged in ways that shaped the development of civilization itself. In the dust and blood of that Mesopotamian plain, the ancient world ended and something new was born. What other pivotal battles in history would you like us to explore? Should we cover Caesar's conquest of Gaul, Hannibal's invasion of Italy, or perhaps Napoleon's campaigns? Drop your suggestions in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss another deep dive into the moments that shaped our world. History isn't just about remembering the past, it's about understanding why we are the way we are today.